Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 18th chapter in the first book of Kings. And before we read the text and analyze it, we just want to establish the cast of characters we'll be witnessing interacting. The first of which is Elijah. He was a prophet who we first met in the 17th chapter. He told King Ahab, who we first met in the 16th chapter as the newly ascendant monarch in the northern kingdom of Israel. And he tells this king in the opening verse of the 17th chapter that there's going to be a drought. There's going to be no rain for a long time. And after that, we read that Elijah lived a life of austerity. He was a camel-clad desert dweller who was fed by birds. And we also read that he healed a widow. But now, Ahab was not necessarily an evil man, but he was just a weak person. So he was very much his wife's creature who set the tone of the moral degradation which defined his reign. His wife was Jezebel. She was a foreigner from Phoenicia, I believe, and she was a fanatic worshiper of Baal, who was a deity who was local to them, and she employed prophets of Baal, prophets who we're going to meet in this passage. And we also witness that Ahab does show at least some hints of positive qualities when he's in the company of Obadiah, a servant of his who was faithful, more faithful than his king was. And after many days it came to be that the word of Yahweh came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, "Go present yourself to Ahab, and I give rain on the earth." So the word of Yahweh is the sign of the prophet. Now, Elijah didn't write any books. He's one of the speaking prophets as opposed to writing prophets. He was heir to a tradition which began with Samuel, and there was always multiple prophets at any one given at several given locations throughout the covenant nation of Israel, by which I mean also Judah. And Elijah prophesied in the northern kingdom of Israel. He was one of the earliest ones. And he, as measured by works, he was the greatest prophet who ever lived. So even though we don't have much of his recorded proclamations, his main ministry consisted in performing miracles, and we certainly witness one here. And he's instructed to present himself before Ahab to approach the king. And remember, he had already told him before that the rain was going to not fall, and it had been 3 years since. So once more, he's instructed to approach him and tell him that the rain's going to fall once more. Thereupon Elijah went to present himself to Ahab, and the famine in Samaria was severe. So Elijah dutifully and obediently presents himself as instructed, and during the time that he did, the famine, which was the result of the crops not having adequate rain to grow, was severe. So 3 years will take the toll out of any country. And Ahab had called Obadiah, who was over his house. Now Obadiah feared Yahweh exceedingly. So as I mentioned earlier, even though Ahab was not a godly man, he had at least one godly man in his employ who we read not only feared Yahweh, but did so exceedingly. That means above average, extraordinary. He was dutiful and attentive to the law of Moses that his king had forsaken, and had compelled the majority of the nation under his rule to forsake. And it came to be, while Jezebel cut down the prophet of Yahweh, that Obadiah had taken 100 prophets and hidden them 50 to a cave, and had fed them with bread and water. So he uses his position of proximity to the royal throne to protect the prophets, and he hid them on his own accord and fed them accordingly, while Jezebel, who was murderously motivated towards their destructions because they exposed what an evil person she was, and that her God was false, and her pagan ways had no place in the covenant nation or the promised land. And we read that there was at least 100 prophets at this given moment in time. And at one point, Elijah, who was prone to despair, murmurs or complains or laments that there is not one other faithful person left in Israel, and Yahweh assures him that there is a remnant of at least 7,000 who remain faithful. And Ahab had said to Obadiah, "Go into the land to all the springs of water, and to all the wadis. It would be that we find grass to keep the horses and mules alive, and not have any livestock cut off." So Ahab is not so much concerned with his people who are starving so much as he is with foreign invasion. So in order to make an army perform, they have to have cavalry, and they need horses, and they need to be strong and fed. So even his concern is not centered on his people, but the animals in his army. And they divided the land between them to pass over it. Ahab went one way by himself, and Obadiah went another way by himself. And as Obadiah was on his way, then, see, Elijah met him. And he recognized him, and fell on his face, and said, "Is that you, my master Elijah?" So as one of the faithful remnants of Israel, he would have known who this prophet who was mighty in word and deed, and he bows himself in his presence upon the recognition that providence had placed him in his path. It's not by accident that the winds of destiny took the wicked king one way and the faithful servant the other way. The faithful servant meets up with the faithful servant, that being Elijah, and he answered him, "It is I. Go say to your master, Elijah is here." Now Elijah wouldn't have had necessarily welcome reception at the prophet seldom did to any of the kings, and but he's going to confront him, tell him what he's instructed to tell him, and present himself as he's been ordered to do. And he said, "What have I sinned that you are giving your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me?" So Obadiah's concern is that Ahab will kill him because his wife had already hunted the faithful prophets of Yahweh, but Obadiah rescued them by giving them hospitality, shelter, and food. "As Yahweh your Elohim lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my master has not sent to look for you. And when they said, 'He is not here,' he made the kingdom or nation swear that they could not find you." So he was so concerned with this man who 3 years ago had told him that there was going to be no rain. During that passage of time, he had come to take him seriously and had scoured the earth for him, not just in his own kingdom, but those surrounding him. And he was in Israel the whole time, living in obscurity in the wilderness, being fed by ravens and visiting villages where miracles needed to be performed. "And now you say, 'Go say to your master, Elijah is here.' And it shall be as soon as I am gone from you that the Spirit of Yahweh takes you away to a place I do not know. And I shall come to report to Ahab, and when he does not find you, he shall kill me. But I, your servant, have feared Yahweh from my youth." So he's not only concerned with his fellow servant, but his own life, because if he approaches the king and then Elijah disappears, as he's prone to do, he's a difficult man to track, difficult man to find. So he's concerned that if he misleads his master, that he's going to forfeit his life. Yet he closes with a statement of faith, "But I, your servant, have feared Yahweh from my youth." So the habitual character was ingrained in him from the foundation of his life. "Was it not reported to my master what I did when Jezebel slew the prophets of Yahweh, how I hid 100 men of the prophets of Yahweh, 50 to a cave, and fed them with bread and water?" So obviously it wasn't reported, because if it had been, then he would have forfeited his life for circumventing the issue and ruling of the royalty. "And now you say, 'Go say to your master, Elijah is here. Then he shall slay me.' So he's going to blow his cover as a hidden and secret faithful follower of Yahweh when he presents to him Elijah, who is perhaps the most faithful servant at this historical juncture. And Elijah said, "As Yahweh of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I shall indeed show myself to him today." So being a prophet, he knows that what Yahweh commands will come to pass, and he's going to be sure that he does everything he can to do it. But inasmuch as he remains submitted, then the Spirit will guide him to where he needs to go and say what he needs to say, do what he needs to do, and be who he needs to be. Obadiah then went to meet Ahab and informed him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. And it came to be, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, "Is that you, O disturber of Israel?" So automatically now, once the desired for interchange or confrontation emerges, it is on a confrontational note when he calls him a disturber, a disruptor of the peace of Israel, which was not doing well, and that was the royal responsibility. Had they listened to the prophets who Yahweh had placed in their paths to issue good governance and to make Israel a shining city that cannot be hid from the sea, to reference Matthew 5:14. And he answered, "I have not disturbed Israel, but you and your father's house, in that you have forsaken the commandments of Yahweh, and you have followed the Baals." So Jeroboam, who was the original king of Israel, had set the path which would be pursued by all of his successors of being idol worshippers, and it had really reached an all-time low at this point with Jezebel and Ahab, but that they were certainly not the first and certainly not the last. They were a middle link and a strong link in the chain and continuum, which began with Jeroboam and lasted until 722 BM, before Messiah. And they had the disruption in the land was on the account of their waywardness and disobedience to the commands, and their specific idol they followed was Baal. And in some sense, all idols are equally worthless because they are all non-existent, but they do have certain characters which were attributed to them, and some of them do pose more dangerous moral models for the worshiper who takes them seriously. "And now send and gather all Israel to me on Mount Carmel, the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who eat at Jezebel's table." So Jezebel was in the practice of employing false prophets for false deities, and she fed them and clothed them and housed them at the royal palace. They ate at her table, and there was no shortage of them. So there were exactly 450, and then so 850 total of two false deities, which would have been native to Phoenicia, where Jezebel hailed. Ahab then sent all the children of Israel and gathered sent for all the children of Israel and gathered the prophets on Mount Carmel. And Elijah came to all the people and said, "How long would you keep hopping between two opinions? If Yahweh is Elohim, follow him, and if Baal, follow him." But the people answered him not a word. Now, they didn't answer because they were confused. They were mixed and misled and divided in their loyalties, and there is good reason that Yahweh demands and commands and deserves exclusive worship with complete integrity of heart, and no dual loyalties to any other alternate deity or any other source of satisfaction. And this reminds us of a few passages in the New Testament, Matthew 16:24 and Luke 16:13. "No man can serve two masters, for he will hate the one, he will love the one and despise the other." And James 1:8, "A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways." So when we are firmly rooted, invested in abiding in Elohim, then we will have the stability of mind and the sincerity and integrity of worship.
And Elijah said to the people, I alone am left a prophet of Yahweh, but the prophets of Baal are 450 men. So even though there were other prophets who had survived during the purge initiated by Jezebel, thanks to the faithful secret service of Obadiah, he was the only one there at that moment in time, and they had summoned all of the false prophets of this false god at their disposal for this occasion. This is a showdown, and we can think of it in American mind as a cowboy shootout where they both draw their pistols at the same time. And Elijah said to, but now let them give us 2 bulls, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but light no fire. And I prepare the other bull, and shall lay it on the wood, but light no fire. So he's determining or dictating the conditions of the competition, which consist of having wood but unlit. So he's going to call for fire from heaven, as we read. And you shall call on the name of your mighty one, and I call on the name of Yahweh, and the Elohim who answers by fire, he is Elohim. So all the people answered and said, the word is good. Well, these people weren't knowledgeable in their belief, but they would certainly respond to a sign from heaven that who they were who they said they were. And as Elijah initiated the terms of the contest, he did so without the presumption. He knew that what he was doing was in the will of Yahweh, whereas if we were to try to prove to skeptics in almost any other situation, it would be inappropriate to ask for him to demand a sign. But for this situation and context, it was completely in the will of the Father. He is capable of making a fire or anything else appear at any location across the universe for however long he wants in whatever degree of intensity at any given moment in time. But it is not, in most cases, righteous for us to ask for him to do so. And Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose 1 bull for yourself, and prepare it first, for you are many, and call on the name of your mighty one, but light no fire. This is essentially a reiteration of the earlier instructions outlined. So they took the bull which was given them, and prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning even until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. So in spite of their passionate enthusiasm and their energetic explanations, there were 450 of them chanting in unison for a significant fraction of a day, evening till noon, we read, so maybe even spanning the course of 2 days. And they... for all their shouting, for all their sincerity, for all their faith, the object of their faith was non-existent and unable to manifest at their request, and so all their energy was in vain. But Elijah is, with a simple, singular statement, accomplishes what 450 of them failed to do, in spite of diligently trying through the course of a significant fraction of a day. And it came to be at noon that Elijah taunted them and said, cry aloud, for he is a mighty one. He is meditating, or he is busy, or he is on a journey, or it could be that he is asleep and has to be awakened. So we tend to depict Elijah and most of the prophets as serious men, but some of them had a sense of humor. So Elijah's mocking them. He can see how silly they look and how silly they sound. And he's not only mocking them, but the deity who they worship, the deity who he charges with being asleep. And whereas Elohim is an inexhaustible creature, he is never asleep, he is always awake, he is always at work, maintaining the entire universe in operation at once. So his job description doesn't allow for sleep. And he is never on a journey because he is omnipresent, which is everywhere at once, or at least capable of being wherever he wants to be or needs to be. And and they cried aloud and cut themselves according to their ruling with knives and spears until the blood gushed out on them. So pagan practices were abominable for a reason. They involved bizarre esoteric practices such as self-mutilation and child sacrifice that there's really no reason to do any of that stuff unless it's for a higher purpose, but just to ask your non-existent deity to manifest or show proof of his existence, which quite simply isn't there, is abject folly. It's foolishness. And it came to be, when midday was past, that they prophesied until the time of bringing the offering. But there was no voice, and no one answered, and no one paying attention. So this continued for some time after the mocking. This went on for about an entire day. It began at noon or evening, and then lasted all until midday the next day. And they, went through all the motions. They honored the terms of the contest in as much as they were able, or as energetically as they could. And they even went to extremes such as self-mutilation, but for all their efforts, energy, and expenditure, there was no voice, no one listening, because no one was there, at least no one by that name. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come closer to me." And all the people came closer to him. And he repaired the altar of Yahweh that was broken down. So this altar may have been left by the faithful remnant of Israel, but what Elijah does is restore it to its design and function. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of Yahweh had come, saying, "Israel is your name." So there was 12 sons of Jacob, and the two of the sons' descendants, those being Benjamin and Judah, inhabited the southern kingdom at this point. The remainder tribes were mostly up north, although the Levites were attracted to the temple and the more Yahweh-friendly, generally, culture and environment and climate. But he's symbolizing an act of unification for their eventual unification. And with the stones he built an altar in the name of Yahweh, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 seams of seed. And he arranged the wood and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the woods and said, "Fill your jars with water and pour it on the burnt offering and wood." So he's competing now. He's going to call on his Elohim, who's going to answer from the sky and send down lightning to prove that he is, and that they are in fact worshiping a forbidden, non-existent, illegal entity. Then he said, "Do it a second time," and they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time," and they did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar, and he filled the trench with water too. And it came to be at the time to bringing the offering that Elijah the prophet came near and said, "Yahweh Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today, you are Elohim in Israel, and I your servant have done all these matters by your word." So as a faithful servant, he's asking for confirmation, some sort of sign that his service was validated and recognized and appreciated, and his strength came from the one to whom he asked for the recognition from. "Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, and let this people know that you are Yahweh Elohim, and you shall turn their hearts back to you again." So even though the remnant was scarce, the potential and the avenue for the reprobate to repent of their reprobate ways and return, have their hearts realigned to their first love of their ancestors and away from the false religion that was the reality, even though there was no reality to it in their own generation. Then the fire of Yahweh fell and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. So only a divine entity was clearly listening and acting in response to the righteous request of his humble and obedient servant, whose request for validation of his approval and his power can manifest immediately in response to that request, proving once and for all to all the crowd assembled and gathered that he was the only real deity and alone worthy of worship. And all the people saw and fell on their faces and said, Yahweh, he is the Elohim. Yahweh, he is the Elohim. So this is something they should have already known, being the covenant nation bound by a covenant and blessed with the law of Moses and all the prophets. There weren't any written ones at this time, but they had some of the Psalms and the Proverbs and the book of Job and other things. But they had all the proof they needed, all the extra proof they could want, in the form of that obvious and dramatic manifestation. And Elijah said to them, Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the Wadi Kishon and slew them there. So prophets are not necessarily pacifists. They are not afraid to eliminate evil if it is for a righteous cause, and these men had just proven themselves to be phonies and charlatans, and their deity either existent or non-responsive, or more in all likelihood not existent at all. And their presence was a blight on the spot of the promised land, and they had to be eliminated by violence. And this ultimately provokes the wrath of Jezebel, who had already launched a murderous purge of the true prophets, of the true and living Elohim, which was thwarted by Obadiah's faithfulness. But this does provoke an additional murderously motivated rampage against the chosen and true prophets of the true and living Elohim. And that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.